Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Heebie-Jeebies TV. If you're new here, my name is Ashley and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. Now, if you guys are into that sort of content, please go ahead and check out my TikTok. I post a lot more content on there. Of course, it's all short story format. I post 1 to 3 times a day on there. So if you guys are interested, take a look. I will link it in the description box for you below. Also, if you guys enjoy my content on here, please take a second to hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment, or even share the video. Everything really does help, and the more engagement I can get on here, the more attention I can get to my channel, which ultimately is the goal. So if you guys wouldn't mind doing that, I would be extremely thankful. Alright, so let's get into today's story. Now, this is a very creepy one. It's a mix of true crime, cults, paranormal, and a little bit of folklore as well. So we have a little bit of everything in today's story. Now, haunted forests are nothing new to the world of the paranormal. For example, you have the forest called Hoia Baciu in Transylvania, you have Epping Forest in England, and you also have the Aokigahara Forest in Japan. All of these forests are known to have very haunting experiences, a lot of dark history within each of them as well, and of course, unexplained phenomenon. And for a closer perspective, I actually did a video on the Epping Forest, and if you guys haven't seen it, I will link it up above here and in the description box below. But that will give you an idea as to how forests could possibly be so haunted with so much dark history. However, there is one particular forest that has been deemed as the most haunted forest in America, and it's known as the Freetown Fall River State Forest. Many people believe this particular piece of land is cursed, and when I say it has a very dark history, believe me, that is an understatement. So the Freetown Forest is located south of Massachusetts near the border crossing over into Rhode Island. Next to the town, it's named after Freetown. It's a pretty large forest spanning over 5,000 acres, so there is plenty of space for mischievous individuals to hide amongst other nefarious activities. Residents of the town have grown up hearing all sorts of creepy stories about the area, including unbelievable crimes that we'll get into in this video, and parents have gone to tell on their children as they grow up to never go into the forest, especially at night. Now, the first modern-day distressing event that truly left its mark on the town and the forest was that of the murder of 15-year-old Mary Lou Arruda. She was a high school student living a fairly normal life until September 8th of 1978 came around. The last time she was seen alive was when she was riding her bicycle around her neighborhood. Unfortunately, when she didn't return home, her parents became extremely worried, and that's when they called the police. Immediately, there was a very large search done for Mary Lou, but absolutely zero trace of her was found. Not too long after, police ended up stumbling upon her bicycle, and there were several clues surrounding it. Next to the bike were multiple skid marks in the dirt that painted a horrifying picture. It was very clear to authorities that Mary Lou had been abducted. Police also ended up discovering several cigarettes near her bike as well, which they ended up saving as evidence. Within a few days of Mary Lou's disappearance, several witnesses ended up coming forward, and all of them gave a very similar description of a local man named James Cater. Police obviously questioned James. They asked him about his whereabouts the night Mary Lou disappeared, but he never gave them a straightforward answer, so basically he had zero alibi. All they really knew about James at this point is that he had a green car that happened to match the one witnesses also described of being in the area at the time. It took 2 entire months, but finally Mary Lou was found, but sadly she was no longer alive. She had been found inside the Freetown Forest, fully clothed and tied up to a tree. Her body had been badly decomposed, but the coroner was able to determine that she had passed away either due to strangulation or asphyxia, and it had also been determined that she passed away the same day that she had been abducted. After a lengthy investigation, police had enough evidence to charge James with her murder. They had the matching sketch of him, they had the car, the tire tracks also matched the tires on his own car, but the bullseye was the skid mark that was found on his car. You see, there was a piece of paint that was found on his car that didn't match the rest of it, so police took a sample of it and matched it to the paint coming from Mary Lou's bike, which ended up being an exact match and therefore convinced police that they had found the right man. It took 3 trials, but eventually he was found guilty in 1996 and sentenced to life in prison. Following Mary Lou's passing came the phenomenon known as Satanic Panic, led by a man named Carl Drew, who called himself the son of Satan and sometimes even referred to himself as Satan himself. To this day, the name Carl Drew casts a very large shadow over Freetown, with many people even refusing to speak his name out loud. These series of events went on to be known across headlines as the Fall River cult murders in a neighboring town close to Freetown. However, many of the satanic events that occurred within these crimes ended up happening inside the Freetown forest, which is why it's included in this video. So Carl Drew was a bad guy. He had a terrible reputation. He was known as a petty criminal, but then things escalated and he ended up being known as a pimp across Bedford Street, which was basically like the red light district in the area. Sadly, he took this position of power that he had and used it to manipulate vulnerable women who were in that business. He would also manipulate very young women in their late teens or their early 20s and force them into the sex industry, which ultimately led them to being trapped within his cult. He would trick women by telling them that they needed his protection, and in order to get that meant that they needed to join his satanic cult, where members would perform all sorts of rituals. If any of the women would ever try to escape, they would be met with extreme violence and even satanic deaths. When all of this was exposed, we would find out that Carl Drew had been holding satanic rituals within the Freetown forest between October 1979 and February of 1980. He proudly declared himself as Satan during these rituals and chanted in unknown languages as he led his followers through multiple human and animal sacrifices. The first victim we would come to discover was Donna Levesque, and she was only 17 years old when her body was discovered on the morning of October 13th, 1979, underneath the bleachers of a local high school in Fall River. Sadly, she did not have the best childhood. She had fallen into the foster care system at a very young age, and so when she got into her teenage years, she was looking to make money and essentially just survive, and so not really having many other options and not having much guidance in her life, she ended up going into the sex industry as a sex worker. And unfortunately, that's where she ended up meeting Carl Drew and ultimately was forced to join his cult. When authorities discovered her body that day, it was a scene straight out of a gory slasher movie. Her hands had been bound with fishing line and her head had been stabbed multiple times. Essentially, her skull had been crushed and broken in, and if that wasn't enough, she had also been sexually assaulted in a torturous and violent manner. After looking over her injuries, the coroner believed that Doreen had been attacked by more than one person, and it was likely that she was stoned until she passed away. He even made the assumption that it could have potentially been a ritualistic sacrifice, and little did he know at the time, he had been 100% correct with that assumption. Then came Barbara Raposa, and she was reported as missing by her boyfriend named Andre Malte on November 7th, 1979. She was also a sex worker, and she was only 22 years old with a young child. Andre had initially told the police that he was extremely worried about his girlfriend and believed that she may have been involved in some sort of satanic cult. Unfortunately, when police looked into him, they discovered that he also had a very disturbing and disgusting history involving Satanism and sexually assaulting women. He then revealed a bombshell that he, Barbara, and Doreen were all members of the cult and that was why he was worried about Barbara. He then brought 2 additional names forward, Robin Murphy, who was just 17, and Karen Marsden, who was 20, and both were active members in the Satanic cult and both also happened to be sex workers. Both of the women were then interrogated and questioned by police, and they've revealed all sorts of disturbing details. Under pressure, Karen finally revealed something very important. She said that Carl Drew had been responsible for the murders of Doreen and Barbara. At this point, Karen could not believe that she was actually telling police all of this information because although she was a member of the cult and she ultimately did want to get out, she made it known to police that she was looking to leave. However, she had this deep-rooted fear of Carl, as did the rest of the members. She knew that he would absolutely come after her if he ever found out that she was talking to police. And although police did offer her to be in the witness protection program, for whatever reason, she ended up declining. Eventually, police were led to the Freetown forest and they were shown exactly where the rituals were taking place. The Freetown forest was a very well-known area full of mischievous behavior. Not to mention that the Native Americans who once lived on the land claimed that it was cursed by demonic spirits, and we'll get into that later in the video. So naturally, this particular place made a lot of sense for a satanic cult. Police would eventually discover the dark and disturbing truth about what was going on within the Freetown forest. There was one particular rock that was used as an altar that was also used as the primary place for ritual sacrifice, both for humans and animals. So time goes by, and on January 26, 1980, Barbara's body was finally discovered in a wooded area of the Freetown forest by a group of hunters. Because it was in the middle of winter when they did finally find her, her body was basically frozen solid and was also found in a similar condition of that of Doreen's body. She had also been tied with fishing line and her head had been violently bashed in. Of course, finding this, police went back to Andre and they started questioning him, and initially he had denied any sort of involvement until he did something that police were absolutely not expecting. He then came back to police and told them that he had had a psychic dream and he had seen how Barbara had passed away and where she was. He gave a bunch of tiny details that you simply would not know unless you had been there, including her exact location and how her body had also been positioned. This then led him to actually being arrested and charged with murder because police were basically like, there's no way you know this many details if you weren't involved somehow. Police then went back to Karen for more questioning, and this time she ended up pointing the finger towards Robin and claimed that she was not as innocent as she seemed, although she was quite young. She said that Robin was very manipulative, she was violent, and she was also involved in the murderous rituals. She also told police that she would be willing to tell them everything about the murders since Andre had been arrested, but in exchange for this, she said that she wanted full immunity of the 2 murders, which police reluctantly agreed to. When police went back to Robin and started asking her some more questions, she pointed the finger towards Andre. So basically it was just a free-for-all. Everyone was accusing each other of what had happened. Robin went on to say that on a car ride that she was in with Andre and Barbara, they had gotten into a fight. Andre and Barbara were screaming at each other and the entire thing escalated to the point where he eventually pulled over inside the forest, and then he pulled Barbara out of the car and violently started attacking her and then ended up bashing her head in with a rock before getting back into the car and leaving her there to die. As for Doreen's passing, Robin claimed that it was Carl Drew who had used Doreen as an example towards the other cult members. He had actually sacrificed her as punishment for trying to leave the cult, and what had happened was that he essentially had stalked Doreen and essentially kidnapped her. Carl and another man brought Doreen to the bleachers where her body was found and tortured her to death in a satanic sacrifice to the devil. Initially, when Robin was told all of this information, she was playing it off as completely clueless. She said she didn't know what had happened to Doreen until she had actually seen the news the following day. Police didn't believe her. The problem here is that both Karen and Robin were telling very contradictory stories to each other, where Karen claimed that Robin would force other members to participate in these satanic rituals as a form of blackmail. At this point, although Karen was working with the police, she still remained extremely fearful that the cult and Carl would come after her. Unfortunately, and quite sadly, she ended up being 100% correct about this, because Carl Drew was not going to let Karen get away with this, and he had planned and executed her murder as a ritualistic sacrifice to the devil. Somehow, Carl and his cult members ended up tracking Karen down, kidnapped her, and brought her to the Freetown forest where the ritual began. In attendance was also Robin, along with several other members. That night of February 8th, 1980, Karen suffered an atrocious death where she was brutally tortured, including having her fingernails pulled out one by one, and her hair was even ripped out of her scalp. They then proceeded to chop off her fingers before bashing her head in, and then several of the cult members ended up snapping her neck. Carl then ordered Robin to finish Karen off by slashing her neck, and it was so bad that eventually they were able to completely decapitate Karen's head. And if that wasn't bad enough, Carl and several men of the cult started using her head as literally a soccer ball as they kicked it around back and forth to each other. There are many other gory and gruesome details about what they did to Karen that night, but unfortunately, after they were done with her, they ended up dragging her deeper into the forest, and that's where they lit her body on fire. It wasn't until April 13th, 1980 that a portion of Karen's skull was discovered deep within the Freetown forest, including a few of her personal belongings. There were also multiple mutilated animal bodies discovered next to her, signs that all pointed that something very dark and disturbing had happened. And sadly, the rest of Karen's body was never discovered. After that, many more witnesses started coming forward implicating Carl Drew, Robin Murphy, and a man named Carl Davis, which gave police a lot more insight into the satanic rituals that were being performed. Eventually, they were charged with Karen's murder, where Robin confessed to Karen's murder, but that Carl was responsible for the other two women. During his arrest and trial, Carl never derived from his satanic beliefs. If anything, it ended up just solidifying this for him even more. Thankfully, Carl Drew was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. Robin was also found guilty, but was given a reduced sentence because of her testimony against Carl Drew. And as for Andre, he was also convicted of Barbara's death and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Carl Davis, he was able to get away because for some reason there was just not enough evidence to tie him to any of the murders, so police had no choice but to let him go. Unfortunately, later on though, he would go on to commit a different crime and was sentenced to 7 years in prison, which although he did go to jail, it was a far cry from the justice that we all wanted. Since the initial satanic cult was eventually dismembered with everyone going to jail, there have been plenty of copycats in the area, leading residents of Freetown to find many dead animals and markings of satanic worship all scattered around the area. But even creepier though are the ghostly apparitions that appear to people throughout the Freetown forest. Residents have claimed to see very dark and shadowy figures lurking between the trees and sometimes even approaching them. They've also heard disembodied voices believed to belong to the people that did lose their lives within this cult, or even remnants of the satanic rituals that have somehow imprinted themselves onto the land. Now, as we move away from the satanic cult that left its residual imprint on Freetown, we approach the Native American beliefs that the land is actually quite cursed. This is in part believed to be why Carl Drew Voodoo chose the Freetown forest to perform so many of his satanic rituals and worshipings, because ultimately, what's better or more ideal than a place that's already said to be cursed with evil spirits, right? So you see, Freetown is actually part of an eerie triangle known as the Bridgewater Triangle, similar to the other triangles that we see around the world, like the Michigan Triangle or even the Bermuda Triangle, where a bunch of strange and unexplained phenomenon occurs. The other two towns that complete the triangle are Rehoboth and Abington, which also include the Freetown Fall River Forest. Now, to understand the depth of this, we do have to go back into history, back to when the Wampanoag tribe was living in the Triangle area approximately 12,000 years ago, long before the European settlers had arrived to America. There was one particular area that was known as the Hockomock Swamp that was once part of the Freetown Forest, although today it has been somewhat separated because of roads and modern day architecture as well as other towns. Back then, the tribe members worshipped the swamp, and it was known to be a sacred burial ground as well for their ancestors. However, as much as they worshipped this swamp, they also feared it because they believed that the deity of death and disease called Hobomok lived within it. From this belief derived the name that we call the swamp today, Hockomock, which translates to place where spirits dwell, that is also believed to lead to the gates of hell. Now, towards the Freetown and Fall River Forest, during the 1600s, there was a heavy amount of conflict between the Wampanoag Indians and the colonial settlers, and as you can imagine, this meant that there was quite a lot of death and war. One of these wars was King Philip's War, and it was fought between the settlers, the English, and of course the Wampanoag people during the 1670s. Ultimately, the prize they were fighting for was the land of Freetown, and it's even believed that King Philip's War was bloodier than the American Civil War, which gives you an idea of how many people really lost their lives, and many believe that because of how violent and horrific King Philip's War was, it's believed that the cursed land manifested itself in a very violent tendency amongst all of the fighters. In 1683, the land was bought from the tribe and Freetown was eventually established, but ever since then, the town has been plagued with a lot of strange phenomenon. People have claimed to see very strange lights in the sky. Other people say they swear they've seen ghostly apparitions, which most people seem to believe are those who lost their lives in the cult or even during the war. And if that wasn't creepy enough, some people have even recorded these very faint drumming sounds coming from deep within the forest that they believe were the Native Americans. There have also been plenty of reports of strange balls of lights within the forest that are seen kind of just floating around and rushing in between the trees. Some people have been confronted by ghostly apparitions of children with black eyes. Not to mention the dozens and dozens of people that have been reported as missing, last being seen within this forest, only to never be found. But that's not it. There are also tales of Native American spirits roaming the area, and one particular spirit is called the Pukwudgies. Now, these creatures are said to be about 2 to 3 feet tall, resembling goblins that roam around throughout the Freetown forest, and they're said to have this grayish skin tone color with dark fur and very large ears, and are also known to cause people to get hurt or to even harm themselves. An example of this very dark behavior comes from several stories of the locals that takes them to a place within the forest known as the Ledge. Since the 1800s, people have reported feeling this very uneasy, unusual feeling whenever they approach this part of the forest with the ledge, and many people have even actually jumped to their death from here. Those who have been in the area have approached this ledge but did manage to fight this very odd feeling and this urge to jump, but they do recall feeling a very intense amount of emotions, most of them resembling dread and despair, in addition to seeing ghostly and shadowy apparitions out of the corner of their eyes. Those who have survived say that they swear they will never return to the ledge because they are unsure that if they do go back, that they wouldn't jump that time. Some attribute this strange phenomenon to King Philip's War because it's said that a bunch of the native people from the land that were fighting in this war opted to jump off the ledge because they basically had absolutely no choice. They had nowhere else to run and they did not want to be captured and held as prisoners of war by the English. Another iconic location within the Freetown forest is one called Profile Rock. And when you look at this rock from the side, it appears to have the structure of a face, with the Wampanoag people believing that this is the image of their past chief Massasoit, whose son tragically passed away around the area. To this day, it's considered to be an extremely sacred rock, with the spirits of the Native Americans are often seen dancing there in the darkness. But of course, no haunted forest would be complete without tales of the Wendigo, a creature so evil that Native Americans and believers of the spirit refuse to say its name out loud out of fear of attracting it. If you don't know what the Wendigo is, it's basically believed to be an evil spirit born out of hunger and cannibalism that takes shape in a half skeleton, half deer creature that roams the woods. It's also said to reek of decomposing flesh, searching for its next meal to satisfy its never-ending feeling of hunger. It's also said to track humans down, roaming the woods, calling out their names, often mimicking a voice of someone they know in an attempt to trick them. But if that wasn't enough to convince you that the land of Freetown is absolutely haunted, maybe this will. There's a road known as Route 24, and coincidentally, Route 24 goes right through the Freetown forest and is well known to be a road filled with hundreds, if not thousands, of accidents. In 2019 alone, there were over 600 vehicle crashes on this dark and isolated road, and in 2017, there were over 500 accidents, with most of them resulting in fatalities. With so much darkness and evil surrounding Freetown Forest, it's hard to believe that there's definitely not something more paranormal haunting the environment. With so much death, satanic ritualism, war, residents of Freetown more than believe that it will likely be haunted forever, and definitely has earned its name as being one of the most haunted locations in America, if not the world. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Freetown Fall River Forest. Let me know what you guys think. Have you ever been to this part of the States? Have you guys ever encountered anything creepy out there? Let me know in the comments below. And again, don't forget to check out my TikTok for more content. And if you guys enjoyed today's video, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.